This is Dalton and PB from Standard Capital. And today we're going to talk about wealth creation. How is wealth actually created, PB? And what does this have to do with startups? Like, why are we making a video about this?
Yeah, great question. So this is actually, a hugely important question. And I think probably most people have no idea how wealth is created. Certainly most politicians don't seem to have really any concept of it. It's an important question for startups, especially because, one of the things I'm asking when I look at a startup is this question of like, where is the wealth created? And for me, probably an example of the kind of startup where I don't see any wealth creation is like NFTs, right? They say, well,
You're just going right for the jugular.
Right,
You're just starting off. Okay, all right.
Or so some of the crypto things, right? They're saying, well, what is the business? Oh, we create this token and then we sell it to someone else. And then, what does that person do? Well, they sell it to someone else. But I can't identify, where the wealth is created. And I think the opposite example that I like to think about, which is maybe not obvious to people, is how do marketplaces create wealth, right? Because marketplaces are actually probably many of our most valuable companies, when you really look under the hood, is actually a marketplace. So like Google and Facebook are both marketplaces. They're both advertising marketplaces. They bring together buyers and sellers on a platform. And the reason that creates money, if you think about it, suppose, you have a small business making, some kind of widget that maybe it costs you $10 to make. And that there are people out there in the world who would love to have this thing, and there are people out there who would love to pay $100. It would make their life so much more valuable. But if you have a producer over here, and then even if you have like 1 million consumers, if the buyers and the sellers can't find each other, that transaction never occurs. And so the way that a marketplace creates wealth is simply by connecting the producer with the consumer, and then that's a positive sum reaction, when the person creating the item and the person who wants the item are able to make that exchange, both parties end up better off.
Everyone is better off.
Everyone wins. And so that's really like the magic of marketplaces, is that they just create wealth by bringing together supply and demand.
Yeah, I think about one of the original .com era startups when the internet was brand new for this, which is eBay. The story about Beanie Babies was that the company that made Beanie Babies was horribly run, like comically bad. And so what they would do is ship certain kinds of Beanie Babies to different parts of the US, but you couldn't get them in other parts. Like you could only get the crab if you lived in one state. And it wasn't even like on purpose. It was just a horribly run company. And so the original arb of eBay is that if you had a glut of one type of Beanie Babies, you could list them on eBay, and the people that lived in other parts of the US could buy that kind of Beanie Baby. And again, when you think about it, kind of everyone was better off.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I thought it was Pez dispensers too. Wasn't Pez dispensers?
Pez was one of the first things that was sold there, but
yeah.
That was a secondary market thing. The Beanie Babies thing, I believe, is what made it really take off.
That's interesting.
Because it created a market where there was none.
Yeah, I mean, eBay is a great example where you think about, how much junk people have packed away in storage containers or in their house, their garage, wherever. And for them, maybe they just want to get rid of it, or it's just collecting dust, and there's someone else who really wants to have it. And again, that's a classic marketplace thing where both parties are made better off through that connection. And then as a marketplace, you're able to collect typically a percentage of that revenue.
One of my best investments at YC was the company Whatnot, which is like a modern eBay competitor, I guess you would call it. And the stories are so cool about how many people are able to make a living selling stuff on Whatnot on the live streams. I don't know. It certainly seems positive sum to me, and everyone's better off.
Yeah. Or even, Airbnb is another example like this, where it started off, those guys actually just couldn't pay rent, right? Joe and Brian had a spare bedroom in their apartment and started just renting it out during a design conference so that they could make rent. And, had that realization that, hey, there's a lot of just like dead space that could be put on the market. And again, everyone wins, because the person with the empty space gets some extra cash. The traveler gets a low cost place to stay.
I don't know if many people have really thought about how wealth is created. And so one of the examples that Paul Graham gave in an essay, just to bring up here, is the idea that you could buy an old car and fix it up and then sell it for more than you bought it for, and that you created wealth from thin air. Like you didn't cheat anyone, you didn't steal, you put labor into an action and it created more value than what the labor was worth.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is unfortunately, again, not people don't always understand, especially kind of at the socialist end of the spectrum. They have a very zero sum understanding of wealth. And so if you think there's a fixed amount of wealth in the world, and then you see someone who has $1 billion, that basically means they stole $1 billion from a bunch of other people, versus if you understand that it's actually possible to create wealth. And then you might instead see, a startup founder, oh, wow, you actually created billions of dollars of wealth and you were able to keep a slice of it, right? Typically a founder, maybe makes it to IPO owning 10% of the company that they've created. And so they've created, something massively valuable and they got to keep a slice of it, versus a zero sum perspective just says like, wow, they must have really ripped off a lot of people.
Yeah. Well, when you think about it, you kind of accidentally made this point yourself at the beginning of the video where you were talking about startups where they're just taking money out of someone else's pocket. Like use the example of NFTs or things like that.
Yeah.
And my theory is that we're not so different than the people that don't believe in startups. We just have a different criteria about who's in the bucket of positive sum things that create wealth and who's not. And that to the anti-tech folks, everything is in the bad bucket. Like it's all a scam. Everything that we fund, everything we've ever worked on is a scam. Somehow Google or Gmail, which you created, is a scam. Again, I don't believe that, but in that theory, all of technology is like ripping people off. And the only way to build wealth is to rip people off.
Yeah.
So
yeah, absolutely. I mean, and again, I think that comes back to, do you have a zero sum understanding or do you have a positive sum understanding? So like, to me, the just like the visualization I always think of, just because it's kind of funny, and I grew up watching DuckTales. If you remember, like Scrooge McDuck had his giant money bin, right? And so he was just kind of like hoarding all of that money in his money bin. And I think, unfortunately, that's kind of like that sort of cartoon level of understanding of economics is where a lot of people are. And if you're working from that space, then, it's very logical to be like, wow, if only we could like bust open Scrooge McDuck's money bin, then like everyone could be wealthy, right? Like we would just set all the money free. People wouldn't have to work anymore. But obviously, that's been tried before and generally ends in like mass starvation, because that's not actually how wealth gets created. Wealth gets created, not just through our physical labor, but through, for example, making good decisions, right? So, our business is a really great example of that. If you make good decisions, you can make a lot of money. If you make bad decisions, you lose all the money, right? Like if we invest in the right companies, it's fabulously profitable business. If we invest only in the wrong companies, we're going to go to zero. And so it's very easy to see in that case, like how much is a decision worth? And that's actually like where the wealth creation happens.
I think, the reason we're making this video, or the advice for founders, is you should understand how your startup is creating wealth. And the more wealth you create for your users and your customers, the better. And if you don't have a good answer to this, I think that's a problem.
Yeah, for sure. So if you can't identify where the wealth creation is, and if all you're doing is eating someone else's lunch, that kind of like limits really your potential. You want something where there's the opportunity to create effectively infinite wealth. And I think we see that probably most clearly with like the AI companies, like how much wealth can be created by, an OpenAI or Anthropic. There really is no limit to it, because they're creating intelligence. And intelligence is again, kind of one of the fundamental ingredients of wealth creation, because the more intelligent you are, you can come up with new products. We can, cure diseases. We can fix environmental issues. We can go out into space. We can build entirely new worlds. And there's no limit to that.
And so what would be the checklist you would give a founder to to self-evaluate this stuff? Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I really think like you start with that question, like where's the wealth creation? And then like, does it have a limit? Right. And that goes back to like the finite versus infinite markets. If the limit is just, we're going to take all of the revenue from this old business that's only worth $3 billion, like, yeah, you're probably not doing a whole lot of wealth creation there, versus if you can point to something else where you say, like, this is a massive opportunity now, but also it's going to be growing, in the way that, for example, Google, when we started out back in the 90s, the internet was actually still pretty small. And so the value that was being created by Google organizing all of that information was limited to the size of the internet. But then we saw that the internet was growing exponentially. And so as the internet grew in 10x and 100x and 1000x, then the opportunity for Google to create value and wealth by connecting people both with information and services was likewise growing exponentially. And so, Google has infinite potential for wealth creation.
So to kind of wrap this up, PB, I like to think about how much value the customers of a startup are getting versus the startup itself to know if they're making wealth. And so think about how much value people have gotten out of Google from Google driving customers to their website, for people researching their company existing because of Google. Hey, we get value from Google for standard capital because when you Google for various terms, you end up on our website. So we're getting value from it. And so the actual value that's being captured by the corporation is a tiny fraction of how much their users are being benefited. Do you have some other examples you'd like to share of this kind of framework?
Yeah, I like to think about this in terms of value creation and value capture. And so to be a successful company, you have to be doing both. And I think a lot of times naively, founders will focus only on the how do we capture value. But again, if you're not really creating any value, you're probably going to have a hard time capturing value. And if you do, you're actually just a parasite, right? We don't want to fund parasites. We want to fund companies that are creating massive value. And the more value you create, it actually gets a lot easier to capture, some fraction of that and grow a huge business. But of course, there are also opportunities or situations where you have a lot of value creation, but maybe not a lot of value capture. So like, Linux, I think might be an example of this. Like Linus has created enormous value, but because he gave it all away for free, he really doesn't really capture that much except simply through his fame. And I'm sure he's doing fine for himself, but it's a very, very small fraction of the value. So the optimal startup is one that is creating infinite value and then capturing, 10% of it.
Yeah. And it's creating value, not necessarily because you're the lowest cost solution versus a competitor. It's that you're so much better than other options. You get what I'm saying? Like trying to be slightly cheaper than someone else is not creating value.
Yeah, ultimately you want something that's not just like 10% better, but like 10x better, right? The best combination is that it's actually both a better product and it's cheaper. And one of the ways that you also want to ask is like, when it gets cheaper, does that grow demand? And that kind of goes back actually maybe to the example of like SpaceX is like, as the cost of launch goes down, that actually opens up whole new worlds of possibilities where, we have companies out there working on asteroid mining or putting hotels on the moon. And obviously those ideas can only possibly work as launch cost goes down. And of course, we see the same thing like with AI, where the whole thing that actually even enabled LLMs and the rise of modern AI was GPUs, which were created for video games, right? And so sort of accidentally, the video game industry set the foundation for AI to exist simply by driving the cost of like matrix multiplication down very low.
So in conclusion, our advice is to create more value than you capture and have a really good idea on where the wealth is being created by your startup. Thanks, PB.
Thanks.